Okay, good morning to everyone. Today we have Professor Giulio Fornaroli. He works in moral, political, and legal philosophy. He obtained a PhD at University College London and now is a researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for Ethics at the Jagiellonian University in Poland. And he works, his work appeared in outstanding journals such as Moral Philosophy and Politics, the Philosophical Quarterly, Analysis, Law and Philosophy, Legal Theory, Jurisprudence, Ratio Juris, Journal of Applied Philosophy, Philosophy Compass, among others. He has an impressive record. Today's talk will be entitled Compensation, Correction, and the Liberal State. Giulio, thank you very much for coming here to share your ideas with us. It's a pleasure. And it's your time now, about 40 minutes presentation, then we will follow, it will follow up with a debate, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Diego, for the invitation, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm very excited to be here and to give this talk. Sorry if I now realize there's a different title between what you have in the handout and what you have on the presentation. The obvious reason is that I gave this talk a couple of times before, and I sometimes use a slightly different title. Sorry about that. So where does this come from? What's the context in which I started thinking about these things? So I've been working for some time on wrongs and corrective justice. Right? I'm now writing a monograph. I'm in the process of writing a monograph about that. And in the past years, I managed to present a general account of interpersonal wrongs and corrective duties in interpersonal ethics, right, in moral philosophy. So I elaborated on what we may call a moral account of interpersonal wrongs and corrective duties. But that account has a kind of lacuna, leaves something out. And that bit that is left out in that account is precisely what the law generally focuses on, which is damages as such, rather than interpersonal wrongs. Or more specifically, I'm interested in wrongful damages. Because again, that's what the law of torts, or in civil law countries, extra-contractual damage liability focuses on. That's its focus, not wrongs as such, but wrongful damages, or what Goldberg and Zipersky in their recent monograph call realized wrongs. And that allows me to have a section on the project on remedial practices in the law in general. Okay. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is that I will try to give some food for thought on a possible political interpretation of practices of damage redress and damage redemption, and damage redress and damage prevention in the law. Okay, so there's been a huge discussion in the philosophy of the law of torts about the principles that should inform remedial practices in the law in general. Right, that's where the literature on corrective justice, as in the law, has kicked in. Outside of philosophy, in legal scholarship in general, there's been a lot of discussion, of course, about the presumed justification of remedial practices in the law and economics movement, especially. I want to try to do something different. I want to try to see whether we can have a response to the question about the best organization of remedial practices in the law that is informed by principles of political philosophy too. All right. Okay.
It's turned off. No.
Okay. No problem. All right. So these are the two questions that I'll try to answer today. First, can a moral account of wronging of the kind I have already produced inform a normative response to damages as such? And secondly, can it provide a normative guidance for the regulation of damages within a liberal state? And to both questions, I'm going to answer in part no. We need something else. That's why I think we need political philosophy to a merely moral philosophy approach to damages as such, or the response to damages in the legal response to damages in the liberal state will be insufficient. So historically, there's been, as I said, two approaches to the justification of remedial practices in the law within at least Anglo-Saxon legal scholarship. And I have to make a bit caveat and apology here that even though I'm not Anglo-Saxon myself, I mostly worked in Anglo-Saxon scholarship, and that's the one I am most familiar with when I talk about legal scholarship. So forgive me if I'm a bit parochial in this regard. Now, the approach that has been prevalent, I think, in the 20th century has been the law and economics approach. This approach based, of course, on efficiency. And the answer it gives to the kind of principles that should inform remedial practices in the law are principles of social efficiency. When we have to decide who's liable for what, who should pay damages for what, our eyes should be focused on social efficiency as such. And that means that for them, the ultimate question we have to answer when we try to figure out how to organize legal responses to damages is a purely distributive one. We have to decide how to distribute liability and compensation. Right, an example I put in the handout is the hand formula in negligence law, which was elaborated by learned Hand, who was a famous judge and also Ronald Dworkin's mentor, right, which has purely to do with the efficient distribution of the socially efficient distribution of costs when you have to decide who's liable for negligence specifically. So everything we have to ignore completely the issue of whether one party was in any possible and loose sense guilty, right? We have to leave that aside completely and just focus on what's the socially efficient way of distributing costs. The opposite approach has been what I call the non-consequentialist approach, or more generally the corrective justice approach, by people like Jules Coleman, Alfred Ripstein, Henry Weyrib, which has argued that there's moral principle underlying the very justification of having a law of torts in the first place, and that principle is the old principle of corrective justice, which goes back, of course, to the Nicomachean ethics. So the legal response to damages for people like Coleman and Weyrib, the point of having a law of torts in the first place is to enact moral principles of corrective justice. The answer I'm going to defend is a bit mixed, in the sense that I'm going to argue that the law economics movement is right in framing compensation as essentially distributive, but at the same time I'm also going to argue that corrective justice does have a role to play in damage redress and damage prevention in a liberal state, but so do distributive justice and autonomy. So just to clarify, these are the cases that I'm interested in. So I'm borrowing this example from a paper by James Penner. Driving along in my Focus, I negligently crash into Mick Jagger, breaking his leg and totaling his new Rolls Royce. I am ruined. Mick Jagger has to cancel his South American tour with the Rolling Stones, causing me a loss of, let's say, £2 million. On top of that, damages for the destruction of his Rolls will net around £500,000. Now, why do I think this is an interesting case, and why am I going to start from there? Well, first, this case obviously includes a damage, right? And I use the term damage, we can use harm, we can use injury. I'm going to treat them as synonymical expression. What matters for me is that a damage is an event that has adversely, I'm going to quote from this paper, which in the sort of metaphysical / moral literature on harms is, I find, the most convincing. And it says, damage is simply an event that has adversely affected an agent's well-being. Which means that the damage is not framed in counterfactual terms. A damage is not an event that has made us worse off than we would otherwise be. Right? It simply made us worse off, period. And that is important because it allows us to respond to possible counterexample. Now, second feature of this scenario, of course, that the damage can be causally attributed, or maybe is equivalent. Again, these are sort of metaphysical disagreements that we have to live with, either causally attributed to or equivalent to the negligence of another agent. And finally, we are assuming that negligence is an example of wrongdoing, although extremely ordinary, of course, very far from moral evil. It could be a case that negligence has no moral relevance at all. There's plenty of people that have argued that, among others, people like Larry Alexander, Heidi Hurd. I'm excluding that option, but I'm happy to discuss it later. And so, because of these three features, there's been a damage, there's been negligence. The negligence is an example of wrongdoing. We can talk about a wrongful damage, right? Or a realized wrong as Goldberg and Sparks claim. And these are precisely the cases where the law believes that there should be a response on the part of the wrongful agent. Right? If we presume that we are under the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of Spain, that principle applies from the Spanish Civil Code. I was trying to look for something analogous in the Catalan Civil Code, but I didn't find it. I don't know. There's not much on extra contractual responsibility in the Catalan Civil Code. I don't know why, or maybe I couldn't, it was a very short research, so bear with me. Anyway. Okay, so corrective justice first. So corrective justice, as we know, is claimed to go back to the Nicomachean Ethics, but what do corrective justice authors precisely take from Aristotle? They derive from Aristotle a principle that I here call correlativity, following especially Weinrib. And I quote from Henry Weinrib, who says that corrective justice links the doer and sufferer in injustice in terms of their correlative position. Which is another way of saying that in corrective justice, the injustice suffered by one victim is the same thing as the injustice perpetrated by the other. Another nice quote is from Michael Thompson. The injustice that we ought to correct in corrective justice is constrained within what Thompson calls an order of right. There's just two parties, a party that has a right and a party that has an obligation has been violated, and now the obligated party as another obligation, right? A remedial obligation. So that there's it's as if there are only two actors on the stage, right? And nobody else. And contemporary corrective justice offers are not just inspired by Aristotle, they're also inspired by Kant's universal principle of right. And what do they derive from that? They derive the contention that we can only explain wrong and therefore wrongful damages in terms of violation of a right, or more precisely of the right to freedom, right to independence, or in sort of Kantian jargon, any kind of act that is inconsistent with the freedom of others, right? So the assumption is that we are all a sphere of freedom where we are in control of our body and property, and any action of other that is inconsistent with a reasonable use of our body and property is, in virtue of that, a violation of a right, and is therefore a wrong, and is what needs to be corrected. Right, in this heroic reconstruction of Kant's principle of right by Arthur Ripstein and for Force and Freedom by 2009, right, Ripstein precisely frames this in these terms. He says, wronging others means either imposing on them purposes they have not chosen or appropriating their means, which include their body and legitimate property. Now, I think that this account has its own advantages. Its main advantage, I think, is that it gives us some kind of intuitively compelling story about why we should care about corrective remedial practices in the law, something that the law and economics movement is, I believe, incapable of doing, because it tells us something that strikes us as quite plausible even in ordinary interaction, right? He explains why we care that others respond normatively when they have wronged us. Right? We don't simply care that there's been a social loss when others damage us, right? We care about the loss in either social standing for us or this rupture of the kind of personal relationship that we had, right? But I also believe that the corrective justice account propounded by these people is ultimately unsatisfactory. The gist of the critique is this: we can't use this account to justify the system of remedial obligation that we find in most ordinary legal systems. And that is because the extent of the damage, right, what the law requires us to repair, is very often independent of the wrongdoer, wrongful or neglectful intention, which is pretty obvious, and we saw an example before with the Mick Jagger case. But that's a problem for the corrective justice offer, because clearly there's a mismatch between the explanation of the wrongful aspect of wronging, which is the violation of others' right to independence, something you can clearly see has moral relevance, and this commitment to a purely reparative view of corrective justice, under which what we ought to do when we wrong others is merely returning to the status quo and making sure that the condition that the wrong person is in is the same as they were before. Now, of course, all these authors have a way of responding to this and say, well, we don't care about intentions per se, we care about the violation of the right. And insofar as you have the right to that specific thing, right, the remedy should make sure that that specific thing is still yours after the wrong. But why? What's the moral principle? Going from the justification of having a particular sphere of independence to making sure that we are guaranteed that that sphere of independence remains the same after any possible interactions with others. Especially because a lot of times what we ought to do to right as in the case before, what the wrongful agent is required to do ex post, right, will depend a lot on choices of the victim. Right? It was Mick Jagger's choice, of course, to purchase a Rolls Royce as opposed to any other car, right? But in violating his right to independence or right to freedom, clearly my violation of we can't say that my violation of the right to freedom is worse just because he decided to purchase a Rolls Royce. Right? It seems that we are mixing up here something that has true moral relevance and something that clearly seems completely contingent on victims' personal choices, which, however, have no moral value at all. Now, one could say, okay, but what about option lock? Now, option lock is a device that is part of the political philosophy in distributive justice, right, in lack egalitarianism. Right, Ronald Dworkin came up with the concept when he said, well, there are two types of luck, the one that we ought to compensate for and the one that every person ought to shoulder for themselves, right? And option luck is the one that you have to live with because it depends, it's the luck that depends on your own previous choices. So if you exposed yourself to risk, then you have to live with the results. We have to live with at least certain results of that risk, precisely because you had a choice before not to expose yourself to that risk, right? So you can say, well, I drove negligently, right? So I exposed myself to the risk of possibly crashing against a Rolls Royce, right? And then I should be held liable for that, precisely because of my prior decision to exposing myself to risk. But that doesn't really solve the problem, because there's still the case where I expose others to particularly egregious risks, and then no risk eventuates altogether, right? And then there's no compensation falling on me. Now, have I violated others' right to freedom by subjecting them to risk? And I really can't see how Ripstein and Weinreich can say no. I really can't say how they can defend their position that by subjecting others to risk, to grave risks that do not eventuate, I am not violating their right to freedom. I really don't see how it can defend. Okay, so I've suggested another account of corrective justice, which derives from not from some comprehensive moral theory, but from some more, if you like, ordinary reflection on corrective practices in ordinary ethics and their ultimate point. And for ordinary corrective practices, I mean things such as apologies, pleas for forgiveness, volunteering to help when one has wronged you, etc. Right? And what do these practices have in common? And my response is that these practices, what these practices have in common is that they are all attempts to either deny or mitigate the message that is, or the meaning that is, the term meaning I derive from Scanlon, that is inherent in all acts of wronging. And what is this meaning that seems to comes together with wronging? Well, it's the idea, essentially, I'm here quoting from Pamela Hieronymi, that you can be treated in this way. Such treatment is acceptable. Okay? It seems that every time we commit an act of wronging, we're sort of bound to communicate to the other person that it's fine to do that because they're not our moral equals. And of course, this message can be presented at various levels of gravity, and in the most mundane cases of wronging, maybe doesn't have a huge impact on the other person, but it seems undeniable that that's what we express whenever we wrong others. And why that? Well, because all wrongs involve what I call moral neglect, which means a failure to attribute adequate concern to others in our deliberation. What I mean by that is that, well, precisely is that the range of reasons for which we acted when we wronged others did not include in a prominent place reasons of respect or concern for others, right? We can present that in contractualist terms. 2, our action is not justifiable to the other person or to a sort of reasonable counterpart of the other person, because again, the range of reasons for which we acted were not sufficiently concerned about them. So by engaging in corrective acts, such as apologies, etc., we express our willingness to repudiate, distance ourselves, disassociate ourselves from that moral neglect. And that give assurance to the other party regarding the stability of their moral status in a moral community. Okay, there's an obvious problem here, because this story that I've just offered only covers wrongs as such, including the wrongs that do not produce any damages, right? But what about a normative response to damages as such? And let me first say that for compensation, I here mean a normative response to damages as such, whose purpose is making sure that a condition that a victim finds herself in is either identical or as close as possible to the status quo. Okay? So the purpose of compensation is either negating or counterbalancing the effect of the damage. I derived this disjunctive interpretation of compensation from a famous paper by Adam Slavny, who has recently published a very interesting monograph on what he calls corrective justice, and I think he's wrong. His book about compensation, but he says it's a book about corrective justice in general. So here's one suggestion about compensation in general. And I'm here quoting from a previous paper. Whenever what we care about are damages and how they alter the victim's well-being, as opposed to the wronging itself and how it disrupted the victim's status of moral equal, we find ourselves in the realm of distributive and not corrective justice. In other words, if we are interested in damages as such, then our response cannot but be distributive and not corrective. Compensation, in my framework, is an assignment, corresponds to an assignment of reparative costs. All damages create reparative costs, right? Because we all care about our well-being, we all want to maintain our level of well-being. Whenever we're damaged, right, there's been disruption in our well-being. We want things to go back to what they were before. We are ready to pay costs for that, but we would also like not to pay those costs, or to see those costs paid back to us. When that happens, we have been fully compensated, right? So compensation means an assignment of reparative costs, and it's, because of that, distributive justice in disguise. That's one of my main claims here. Okay. Possible objections to that. What about correlativity? If you think that compensation is about distributive justice, right, and distributive justice, but the distributive justice is not correlative. Distributive justice is a society-wise mechanism of implementing justice. Cannot be restricted to victim and perpetrator as such. I mean, sometimes we do think that there are principles of fairness or distributive justice that apply in interpersonal scenarios. Think about a parent that has to distribute gifts among the children, but that's pretty rare. Normally, when we think about distributive justice, we think about some kind of societal environment. Right, for roles, the basic structure of a society. We can think about people living under the same jurisdiction. If you're a cosmopolitan, you might think every single person on Earth, but we still need some kind of societal level environment. So what about relativity? And I say we can get rid of it in compensation. Okay. I don't see why correlativity must be a requirement of compensation. On the contrary, I think there are advantages if we start assuming that compensation for wrongful damages is never restricted to perpetrator and victim alone. Another possible objection, and it's not really an objection, it's just a way of attacking me without accepting my premise, says, but Giulio, isn't compensation just damage, directive, corrective justice? Isn't compensation just a part of corrective justice that is focused on damages rather than wrongs as such? I think not. And I think there are reasons why we should reject that interpretation of compensation. Because adopting that view, that compensation is just a part of corrective justice that is focused on damages as such, which is what Slavny, for example, says, does not allow us to distinguish between two different kind of duties that we have, which have very different types of grounds. Right? On the one hand, we have the duty to yes, that is point 2 in this slide. On the one hand, we have duties as wrongdoers to respond normatively to the fact that we have wronged another person, so what the wrongdoer owe to the victim of the wrongdoing. And then there are the duties that, as moral agents in general, or more precisely, as members of a particular community of distribution, we owe to all other parties in the communities as a result of the fact that they're worse off than they were before, for whatever reasons that are independent of their own volition. Okay? So compensation to me is essentially a part of the compensatory duties are a subtype of the distributive duties that we have qua members of any kind of society in which distributive justice applies. And I think there are also other advantages of framing compensation this way. It makes sense of linguistics usage. We often oppose to the absence of compensation by saying things like, it is unfair, I need to pay for this. And then I like the fact that we can thus focus on what victims need other than what the wrongdoers owe, which has a lot of advantages in many circumstances in which victims clearly need something as a result of having been wronged, and sometimes they need a lot, right? But wrongdoers may be hard to find for whatever reasons. And I think it's good that in these cases we avoid correlativity, we avoid thinking about what happened between wrongdoers and victims, and we focus on victims as such, and we find ways to make sure that victims are compensated regardless of whether wrongdoers can be found or not. Okay, how much time have I got left?
Maybe 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, so that's an interesting example that I'm going to talk about in the Q&A.
5:10.
Okay, so
I remember when we start.
so very, very, very quickly, that's a nice story that I put not in the paper that I circulated, but in the previous one. I have other examples in the paper that I sent, but this is my favorite because it's a real case. It's about airplane that in 1980 in Italy was flying from Bologna to Palermo, a civilian airplane, and was intercepted by a missile that was just there. Nobody knows till today which Air Force shot the missile. The missile hit the airplane, the airplane was shot down in the Tyrrhenian Sea, everyone died. And obviously because it's quite uncommon that civilian airplanes are hit by missiles, plus there was a lot of cover-up, as you can imagine. So it wasn't clear at the beginning. It took years and years and years before the truth came out. So at the beginning, nobody knew exactly what happened, and the company that was managing the airplane, right, was forced to pay compensation. And it went bankrupt because they had to pay compensation to all the passengers' families. And even though I don't necessarily care about, the supposedly super wealthy CEO of this company, but I still find it deeply unfair that in this case we had to apply some kind of correlativity principle, and we had to say, okay, there has been victims, and therefore we have to find a perpetrator, and even if we are not exactly certain who the perpetrator was, then we just say, oh, it's the company, and we allow that they go bankrupt instead of figuring out alternative strategies to compensate the victims, such as making, the entire society pay, obviously following other distributive principles regarding the capacities of various agents, etc. Now you could frame this case as rather differently. You can think that it's a strict liability case, but it would still be unfair because the company went bankrupt, right? So presumably you don't wanna say, even if you believe, and I do believe that strict liability is fair in some cases. You don't want to say that, you don't want to accept that companies can go bankrupt for something that you haven't managed to explain in terms of culpability. Okay, so my very final slides are about what I call the political response to damages. So the way of organizing, if you like, an ideal system of damage redress and damage prevention that responds to principles of either moral or political philosophy that are generally compatible with a broadly liberal understanding of political philosophy. So I've been suggesting that compensation is distributive. Does that mean that when liberal states organize a system of damage prevention and damage redress, they should ignore wrongdoing? Absolutely not, for two reasons. First, because distributive justice itself sometimes requires that we distribute according to responsibility. Right? Desert is a plausible distributive criterion in many circumstances. Right? And guilt is a form of negative desert. Right? So imagine two agents that are equally well off and one damaged the other. Then I'm absolutely okay with saying that the sole criterion that we should follow in determining who should compensate whom is wrongdoing, right? Who is responsible. But the second and I think more controversial reason why I think corrective justice still matters is that I'm sort of buying here into a form of moderate perfectionism, right? And I'm saying that one of the roles that a just basic structure should play, and I'm saying this utilizing the terminology of basic structure from Rawls, but at the same time going against Rawls in subscribing to a form of perfectionism. One of the roles that I ascribe to a just basic structure is that it should guarantee that citizens relate to each other justly, including in discharging their everyday moral corrective duties. So what does it mean in practice? Well, I give some examples in the paper. But in general, what I mean is that states should at least facilitate people in their observation of ordinary corrective duties. And they can do that when damages occur, even if we don't assume that the wrongdoers must necessarily be the person that compensates the entirety of the damage. Okay, so sometimes even when no damage occurred, right? So in the paper, I give this example of a failed scam, right? So there's this classic, used car dealership, right? We always use that as an example of scam. And used car dealers wanna scam the buyer, but the scam fails because the buyer is an amateur mechanic, so he can immediately understand that there's a failure in the engine just by listening to the rumble of the engine. Right, so the scam fails. There's been no damage, right? Now we could say, well, criminal justice can still be brought in, right? The scammer could be prosecuted. But I want to say, well, why shouldn't we establish a system by which the failed scammer still owes something to the buyer? Not in terms of monetary compensation necessarily because there's been no damage, right? But in terms of being required by law to, or at least not prevented by law, to undertake some corrective gesture. And I stop there because I don't, I don't have sort of full-blown indications here, but these are the cases that I have in mind. Now, but of course, like I said, the liberal state's response to damages should also be sensitive to distributive justice in terms of making sure the victims are adequately compensated when and if they most need it, and making sure that reparations do not have an adverse effect on distributive justice. As such, what I mean here is that, cases like the Mick Jagger at the beginning should not be used to crystallize or even worsen distributive inequalities that are there in society, right? We should make sure that damages cannot make two individuals even more unequal than they were before. And finally, and it's another sort of controversial idea that I want to introduce in the end. Personal autonomy, which is a key liberal value, right, if there is any, I think should also play a crucial role here. And the autonomy I have in mind, I call it autonomy as manipulation. It's partly inspired by what David calls autonomy as sovereignty, although it's slightly different. And I say it's the ability to make a choice that is informed by your interests and values rather than by manipulatory external factors. Manipulatory external factors are, for example, sanctions. Every sanction, right, is a manipulatory factor because whenever you have to factor in the effect of a sanction, then you will make a choice that is less informed by what you really want and more informed by what the state wants, which is fine in many circumstances. And obviously, I'm not against sanctions in general. I'm not an anarchist. But I think in a liberal state, we want that to happen as little as possible. And I don't think that sanctions as such are the only instruments that have this manipulatory effect on autonomy. A system of liability, too, can have exactly the same effect. And so, sometimes, I think we should treat people in the opposite way than the way your parents told you that you should be treated, right? One of the things that our parents always taught us is that we have to take charge of our choices and be held liable for them entirely. And I think some states sometimes can, on the contrary, resist that and accept that certain choices that people make can be accommodated by society. I'm borrowing this idea from Shana Schifrin. Sometimes we can, if we live in a community, we should accept that the external cost of some individual choices may be borne by society rather than by the individuals that made those choices. And that is a way of respecting, again, what I call autonomy as manipulation, which is this ability to make choices that are not manipulated by external factors. And in the paper I also write that I don't think that autonomy as manipulation is of intrinsic value. It's most likely of instrumental value, but that things of instrumental value are still valuable, so we should pay respect to it when we elaborate public policies. Okay. So in the end, what am I suggesting here in this talk? that we should definitely abandon this, right? That we should definitely abandon this old say that comes from the Code Napoleon that I quoted before in its rewriting in the Spanish Civil Code, and that we find it in many civil codes around the world, right? The idea that there is some kind of legal duty that always forces us to repair any kind of damage that we have caused through our negligence or fault. I mean, here it just says fault, but then the Spanish code adds negligence, right? And negligence is mostly what the law of tort or extracontractual liability focuses on. There is nothing wrong in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand is a classic example of a country where in the civic area of car accident, there is no personal liability, right? Compensation is paid through a national insurance. And I think there's nothing wrong in New Zealand, or more precisely in what Davide famously called New Zealand Star, which is a state where citizens do not have to pay compensation for car accidents when they're negligent, but they are still obliged by the state to discharge some corrective duties, which they can do by, I don't know, like writing a letter of apology or helping the victim in filling the report or things like that. Right? And that implies that I'm fine with the idea that some damages may actually be left to the victim to shoulder, right? Provided it does not prevent wrongdoers from discharging their corrective duties, right? Mick Jagger decided to purchase a very expensive car, so because of that, he's got more, he suffers higher damages than the ordinary person when his car is involved in an accident. Well, it was still his decision because could have purchased a cheaper car. So why should we pay for it? So I reject the principle that compensation is always morally required. I also rejected the idea that damages are always morally relevant. And I think that abandoning these principle and being revisionary is the first stage in elaborating a system of a legal system of response to damages that is both fair and compassionate. Thank you.